Welcome to another episode of EQ Unlocked. And as always, I appreciate you guys being here. You know how this works. And today we're going to go into something that's pretty deep, but not deep in the way that I normally mean it. So today we're going to talk about the nervous system. And so the title of today's episode is Wired Before Words, how your nervous system was built before you were born. And of course, as always, I'm going to go into some specifics about life, and we're going to get into that. But before you had language, before you had memory, before you had choice, your nervous system was already being wired. And, this can be why calm feels unsafe for some people, why people overreact and they don't know why, why logic doesn't override emotion. Emotional growth doesn't start with awareness, it starts with regulation. And unfortunately, in some cases, regulation is shaped long before you ever had control. And so let's get into it. I was on a podcast the other day. I was a guest on another show, and I really appreciated that. It's called Over the Rainbow. You guys should check it out. The guy's name is Bob, and he's really passionate about helping people. He's really passionate about growth and learning and learning about himself and improving life. So I just want to start there because I really appreciate being on his show. But he asked me a question, and I wasn't really satisfied with the way I answered it. He asked me, he said, "Well, people talk about the nervous system all the time, but what is it?" And when he asked me the question, my mind went to a way to describe the nervous system rather than simply saying what it was. And so I'm going to start there. Let's start with this. What is your nervous system? The nervous system is the command center and the communication center for your entire being, right? So your nervous system is what tells you something is threatening, what tells you something is safe, what tells you something is, you know, it then transfers that information to your body that tells you how to react. And all these things happen unconsciously. You don't even realize these things are happening. So sometimes, like for myself, for example, eh, something would happen and my body would tense up. My heart would start beating faster, and I couldn't even understand why. And so these triggers, as I've come to know them, were things that I couldn't even necessarily see or connect to an activity. And so I started asking, why? Why are these things happening inside my body that I'm not aware of, that that I seem to have no control over? And so then I was fortunate enough to be taught by somebody who took Dr. Bruce Perry's work very seriously. And Dr. Bruce Perry, if you don't know him, he's a child psychologist, trauma and neurodevelopment researcher. He's known for a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and he developed the neurosequential model. And so, what that model essentially states, and there's obviously it's a lot to it, and I don't want to bore you guys with this, but what it essentially states is that our nervous systems are created in embryo. So, whatever our mother experiences, those signals, so to speak, are passed down to us. All right. And so the brain develops from the bottom up, the brainstem, the midbrain, limbic, and then cortex. And the key is that the lower part, they wire first. And so, I'm trying not to go too deep into this and I'm trying to keep it relatable. So I'm going to skip the details about how all that happens. Okay. Because frankly, it's probably pretty boring to you. And yeah, if you want to know more, of course, we could talk about it more. Just leave me some feedback and we can go there. But the nervous system is shaped by maternal stress, cortisol levels in your mother, safety, nutrition, environmental chaos. So what that means is if while you were in your mother's stomach, you know, and she was getting the hell beat out of her, or reverse, she was beating the hell out of other people, if she was cussing people out, if things were chaotic and crazy, well, if that was taking place, your nervous system is already wired before you even take in fresh oxygen. You are already wired for chaos. And how many of us stop to think to ask our mothers, "What was life like for you when you were pregnant with me?" I know I didn't. The womb is not neutral. It's biochemical communication. And so I didn't realize this until years later, right? Years after Journey was born. But I started looking at her life, her early life, and I started making connections between what she was experiencing, the behavior she was displaying, and what her life was like before she was born and after she was born. And so this led me to really digging in and to really trying to understand, wow, wow, we excuse my language, we messed up. We fucked up. And when I say we, I mean her mother and I. You see, our relationship was not at all healthy. It was not at all anything good. You know, her mother had been used to being in abusive relationships. As I talked about, I was much different than the man I am today. My repressed memories had just come back, literally within probably 8 months of my ex-wife becoming pregnant. And so I'm dealing with that, but her mom is dealing with her own internal demons. And so, at this time, her mom's pretty violent. You know, uh, I talked about this a little bit, but, because her mother was a little bit older when she was pregnant with Journey, she had to have a lot of ultrasounds. And in my mind, being a father meant that I was going to be there all the time. It didn't matter if she was in her mother's womb or, if she was 17. I was going to be there continuously, right? Because that's what being a father is to me. Now, my ex-wife's experience, well, her first child's father disappeared as soon as she got pregnant. And so we had very conflicting views of what father's role was, right? And we all both had our own childhood demons, our own upbringing that shaped our worldview, and so things were messed up, right? But what I realized is that during all these rides to these ultrasounds, my ex-wife would undoubtedly release physical aggression on me. I would literally be driving in the car and she would just punch me in the face, like just literally sucker punch me in the face. And and that happened literally every time. And she probably had 6 or 7 ultrasounds. And so every time we were on the way to a doctor's appointment, that would, and her doctor's appointments are about an hour away from where we live. So you can imagine how intense that those rides were. Now, if I had the insight that I had today, back then, I would have simply driven myself. We would never been riding together, right? But I didn't have that insight. Nevertheless, I'm still responsible for the impact that it had on our child. So it's still my job to learn, to grow, to educate my child, to educate myself, right? And so I just want to give you guys some background of where all of this information came from, why I started digging into it the way I did. And so what happened in those in that time period where Journey was in being formed inside her mother, her baseline was being wired for survival, right? It was being wired for survival. And then after she was born, that survival mode, it became even more natural. Regulation didn't really happen until after her mother and I separated completely and totally. And so, with all that being said, you know, there would there would be certain things that Journey would do that I didn't quite understand. And so, there was a time, and I'm sure if you search my old social media feeds, you'll find this, but there was a time when Journey was terrified of the police, absolutely terrified of the police. Now, I was confused by this because, I didn't look at the police any kind of negative way. I just didn't have that view of him. Her mother certainly didn't have that view of him, right? She was much more of the mindset that, you know, right is right and wrong is wrong, as far as the police are concerned, and they seem to always be right, even though they are not always right. But that's neither here nor there. A whole nother conversation we'll get to another day. But so I couldn't understand why Journey had this fear of police. And then I thought back. Journey was about 6 months old, and she might have been a little bit older. She might have been up to one. I don't know. But her mother had a doctor's appointment, and you know, her mother and I had been fighting, and I said, "Hey, just I don't care if you go to your appointment. I don't care what you do. Just leave Journey here. Don't take her with you because you're too angry to drive with the baby in the car and these things." And so her mother insisted upon taking her. And again, being the foolish version of myself I was at that point, I insisted on going along to ensure that she was going to behave appropriately. Because you have to understand, I couldn't determine the difference at that point in my life between how she treated me and how she would treat the children. In my mind, she was a violent beast. That's how I saw her. And so I was afraid for the kids. And that fear, little did I know, would drive me for much longer than that situation, but it drove me. And so she got in the car, and I got in the car behind her, and I'm in the passenger, she's in the driver's seat. And another one of these situations where she's punching me in the head, and I tell her, I'm like, stop. I'm gonna call the police, and I'm gonna make them stop this car. And then Journey and I are gonna get out, and I'm gonna walk her back to the house. Stop the car. She refused. She punched me in the head. And so I called the police. Not because I wanted her to get domestic violence charges, but because I want her to stop the car, right? A long story short, this is in West Virginia. And so the police didn't catch up with us for about 25 minutes. And so when they finally caught up with us, they pulled me out of the car, and I go to the back of the car, and I'm talking to the police officer. Of course, my ex-wife is a social worker, so she has the language to use to make it seem okay. And we're in West Virginia, which is no disrespect to the people there, but they have a very different mindset than a lot of other communities or places. And so in their mind, man should always have control. He should, it was preposterous to them that she was hitting me and I was calling the police. That was absolutely insane. As a matter of fact, the cop actually scolded me. You guys got to calm down and just get along and get together. I'm like, bro, she's punching me in the head. Like, what the fuck do you mean calm down? Right? And excuse my language, but that's what it was. And so what I realized is that as Journey got older, the only interaction she had with the police was that one. And so the only view she had of the police was the police talking to her father in a way where the body language would have seemed negative. And so that was the only view, aside from news, TV, things of that nature, that would have shaped her view of police. And so I didn't want my daughter to go through life being afraid of the police, right? I didn't want her to have that belief. I wanted her to see them as they were. That some police officers are good, some are bad, but they're all people. And so if you treat them like people, then you should be expected to be treated like a person back. And so I didn't want her to hate the police, right? And so I took every opportunity I could to introduce her to police officers that were kind, that were compassionate, that were honest, that were helpful. And so at one point, I had an interaction with the police officer, and I explained this situation with my daughter to him. And he was like, "Oh, okay, okay." And he took the next step, right? He took the next step to really help my daughter to break this view of the police that she had. And what he allowed her to do was sit in his cruiser and press the buttons and play with the lights and all that kind of stuff. And he created that experience for Journey. And so after that happened, when she saw police and interacted with them, There was no more longer this hesitation, this fear. It was an acceptance of, oh, okay, they're just people. They're people who have a job. That's it. That's it. And so slowly but surely, we acclimated her nervous system to no longer saying that is a threat, despite the fact that it was very hard to pinpoint when it became a threat. And so that's what nervous system regulation is all about, right? It's understanding what happens inside us and how we perceive the world. And while I took the extremely long way around by explaining that story, I was just trying to give you some insight into how it shapes our worldview. Now let's take it the other way. Let's say I would have never taught Journey that police were just people who had a job. And let's say, for example, she grew up believing that police were bad based on an interaction that she wasn't even consciously aware of, right? Or what if I would have never considered the fact of what happened to her nervous system when she was in the womb, right? Well, that changes the way I do everything. That changes the way she does everything. And it's all unconscious. So, by looking at that, by looking at this situation, by looking at these things, you can understand how that would in, impact everyday life from all different angles. So, going back to this nervous system, you know, brainstem, that's survival, right? The atomic nervous system is fight, flight, or freeze. The limbic system, that's emotional processing. The cortex, that's reasoning, that's logic. And so you can't reason with a brainstem. It's two different areas of your brain formed at two different times in your life, right? And so now you can hopefully understand how a mother and what a mother is experiencing during a pregnancy shapes that child's inner world. So going back to regulation, awareness, choice, well, when you're dysregulated, the cortex goes offline. Awareness collapses and choice narrows down because it's now about survival. And so, with that thought, I created ORS. And so, because I understood that if there was a system that was going to improve performance, well, it had to stable the physiology first. And so now I want to go into to something a little bit different, like a little bit of a different thought process. And I want to talk about why sometimes calm feels unsafe. And so if you're familiar with chaos, right? Like, chaos is your normal. Like that's what you grew up in. That's how your mother was when she was pregnant. That's been your life all along. Unfortunately, I realize there's a lot of people who have never experienced that, and that's good. And I'm happy for those people because that means you have less work to do than those of us who were born into chaos. But when chaos is familiar, calm is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, whether it's good or bad, can be perceived as a threat. And so your nervous system activates. And so, you know, again, this is physiology, right? This is not conscious thought. This is not conscious processing. This is just your body and how it's designed, right? So think about the person at Walmart throwing a fit, and I always use this analogy, but they're throwing a fit at the cashier over what seemingly is nothing, right? That's dysregulation. That's because they've never learned how to calm themselves in a very quick manner when something dysregulates them. And it's not necessarily their fault because you just don't know what you don't know. Now, the good news is that neuroplasticity makes change possible for everybody, right? And so the nervous system is adaptable. changes through repetition. It stabilizes through patterned regulation. And regulation is trained. It's not demanded. You can't just tell your nervous system, okay, we're going to be calm today. We are going to be calm today. It doesn't work like that. As much as we would like it to, no amount of money, no amount of grind, no amount of force, no amount of any one thing in my experience can create regulation within an individual. And so, with that being said, it's really important to recognize that's what makes NALs and ORS so powerful, is because they're created not from, well, they're created from my experience, but more importantly, they're used through you. They're used through your experiences. They're used through your thought processes. You develop your own system internally without ever realizing it, right? And that's the beauty of those systems. And so I learned that I was so dysregulated my entire life. I didn't even know what regulation even began to look like, right? Until until I started looking at the people I loved and wanted life to improve better, more for them. I looked at my biological daughter Journey and I said, "Oh, she deserves better. She deserves better than this. Unfortunately, she deserves better than what I was able to give her earlier in life. So I'm going to work to become a different person so I can give her the best version of me before I die." I looked at Ashley and I told said of my wife, she deserves a better version of life for herself, right? But I knew that I couldn't give. I looked at my stepchildren, Mel, Finley, Gabby. I looked at them, and I said they deserve a better life, but I can't give it to them until I know what it is. Until I've experienced it, I can't give it to you. I can't deliver that to you because I don't even know where to start, right? And so through the love for other people, excuse me, the love of other people for other people, these systems were born. And so my love for them made me want to improve myself. And I knew that I couldn't improve myself through sheer willpower alone. That wasn't enough. And so I was willing to do whatever I had to do to become the man that the people in my life deserve to have. And what I realized is that so many people looked at themselves like I looked at myself, like somewhere along the line I was broken and I couldn't be fixed. But the truth, I wasn't broken, and neither are you. We were just patterned. And so there are some tools that you can use, day to day, to kind of start to regulate your nervous system. Of course, you can take some slow, deep breaths. That would work. Predictable routines, even if it's just a piece of a routine in the morning, right? Get up, take a shower, brush your teeth, whatever routine you have, and you have a routine, make it work intentionally. Do it intentionally. Bring attention to this pattern that you have. By having that a little bit of attention, then you can create, you know, a little bit of awareness, and you can start to make shifts. And then repetition that equals intensity. So give yourself 2 minutes a day just to sit in silence and allow yourself to feel whatever you feel. No justification, no rationalization, no distraction. You deserve that. Give it to yourself. And lastly, stop trying to think your way into calm. It doesn't work that way. You're trying to use a completely different part of your brain. When you try and think yourself into calm, it doesn't work that way. Remember, regulation, awareness, choice, not the other way around. So I'm going to end it here. You were, we, we were wired before we were aware, but we're not locked into that wiring. And the truth is that regulation is the gateway to becoming who you want to be. You know, next episode we're gonna get into another young lady young lady I worked with, and I think you guys are gonna really enjoy this one. But as I said, I started that case study situation where every Thursday I go over a kid that I worked with or a person that I worked with, and hopefully you can learn about yourself from their experiences. And so I really hope you join this Thursday, 9 a.m. as always. And again, my friends, I truly appreciate you being here. I truly appreciate you taking a part of this journey with me, rather. And as always, before I stop this episode, let me hit it one more time. That book, my book, Everyone is a Suspect, it's going to be hitting the shelves real soon. And so I would ask you to get out there and grab that. It's going to be a great insight into yourself and through again my experiences. But of course, there's going to be questions and answers and things that are going to really help you to get to where you want to be. So, as always, my friends, I bid you adieu and be amazing. Be you.
As this episode comes to a close, take a moment to notice what stood out for you. Emotional intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about building awareness, understanding yourself and the people around you, and choosing how you respond, especially when things feel difficult. Growth happens through reflection and practice, not pressure or perfection. If this conversation supported you, consider sharing it with someone who may benefit from it as well. To explore more tools and resources around emotional intelligence and personal development, connect with EQ Unlocked and Knowles. Until next time, remember, better awareness leads to better choices, and better choices lead to a better life. This is EQ Unlocked.